Hi everyone, Kai here with you today from A Place for Kai. I'm doing another one of my sparkly poinsettia cards, similar to the one that I did for Ileana the other day on our blog hop, to celebrate your uniqueness. And a couple of you asked how I did this card, so I thought I would do this video to show you. To start, I'm using my Memory Box Snowflake Flurry stencil, and I'm doing a stencil monoprint background. That's where you just add the ink to your stencil, add the colors that you want, and then spritz it liberally with water. And then transfer it onto your paper medium. In this case, I'm using Fabriano hot press watercolor paper, and the inks I'm using are Tim Holtz Distress inks in Evergreen Bough, Pine Needles, and Peacock Feathers. I also use those colors for the poinsettia, but I add in Lucky Clover and Cracked Pistachio. Now, as the stencil isn't quite as wide as I would like it to be, I just make it wider. The piece of paper to the left where I had the inking done on is a piece of laminated cardstock. So it retains the ink, and I just drag the stencil through that ink again and add the design to the paper. I then, once this is dry, this panel, I die cut it using Simon Says Stamp Stitched Rectangles die. Now I'm moving on to the poinsettia. I'm using Penny Black Scarlet Majesty to do this technique, and I have it in my original Misty. I also did the stenciling, as you could see, in my Misty with a piece of saran underneath it all for easy cleanup. Now to do this, I first want the impression on my cardstock, which is also Fabriano hot press watercolor paper. So I just lightly add ink to the stamp and then close my cover and add it to the paper. That just gives me my general layout and helps me decide where I want to add the ink. Using the Tim Holtz or any small cubed ink such as this makes it easier to do this, as you're kind of getting into those tiny places on the stamp. I'm going around the edges of each of the leaves. As we know, the bigger part of the poinsettia is the leaves. The flowers are actually the smaller petals in the center of the flower. So I'm going around and along the edge, dragging in the ink on the edge of each of the leaves. I first work with the Pine Needles color, which is the darkest color. I'll then come in and add the Evergreen Bough, and finally add the Peacock Feathers. And then I don't have the cubes in the Lucky Clover or the Cracked Pistachio, so I finish off with the markers. It's a long process. It's not something that you can do quickly. It depends on how you want your flower to look, of course. But I take my time at it, as I want to be careful where I'm putting the ink down and how it's going to appear on my image. I've added most of the color here, and I'm going to clean my stamp, which I do periodically as I'm doing this kind of technique. I'd like to see how much ink I have down, so cleaning up the stamp gives you an idea of how much ink you've got on the stamp. I'm going to start using the cracked pistachio now. And what I do with it, I basically highlight. I add it again to the sides. I add it to the berries. I define with the marker, with the cracked pistachio marker. And I also add enough because at the end, with just a damp watercolor brush, I'll be bringing or pulling the color into the center of the leaves. I want to keep it very light, so it'll only be a highlight. So very lightly the color will come into the center of the leaves. You'll see that in the finished card. So right now I'm coloring the flowers, adding a lot of color to these, and I do this, add quite a few layers of this. And I'm tilting the MISTI so I can see the inlay of the flower part better.
What do you want? You want up?
Well, my bird usually sits on my lap when I'm doing this, so I'm talking to her. Her name is Cece, and she's a cinnamon pied cockatiel.
They say something down together and she doesn't want to.
I'm just showing where I'm going to add color, where I want more definition. Again, I'm just holding the cover of my MISTI up so I can see the different places that I want to add the color. The windows to my right, which is the reason I'm doing that. Defining the edges of the interior parts of the stamp to add in extra color, building it up. You can see here, I don't go right across the stamp. I'm just adding a little bit of color along the edges. Now, as I finish this up, this part of the card, I don't have a die that coordinates with the stamp, and I do want it cut out, so I use my scan and cut and I scan it and then direct cut it. In the process of doing this particular one, I managed to cut off one of the berries, but I do add it in towards the end, which you'll see it added in at the end of when I'm finishing up the card. I'm showing you there where I want more color added. So this is the flower finished and die cut, and the background is also die cut with the stitched rectangles. I am working on a piece of laminated photocopier paper, and when I did the stencil, as I mentioned, I was on laminated cardstock, which I also use for this part of the process. I'm going to be adding the stickles. I end up using the ice stickles. This is the clear one, and I decide I like the ice. That took a few minutes, didn't it? I just lay it down on the laminated piece. It washes up perfectly in cold water, so no problem with that. And I have right here, I use this brush, which is a straw brush, different lengths, so it's not even. It takes the stickles up and has it on all the different levels, so you don't get any globs when you're doing the background like this. I just pounce it onto the piece and making sure that I cover the complete background. I would like sparkle everywhere, even though part of it will be covered up by the flower. I still do the whole card. And then I do the same process for the flower and the little bit that I cut off. I add a little bit more of the stickles to the flower than I've used on the background, and it dries very quickly. You can see the brush there a little bit better. So I start here on the flower. I add a bigger glob because I want more of it on the flower. And just pounce it too, very lightly. Doesn't take a lot to transfer the stickles. So I want my panel to be on foam dots or foam tape for dimension. So I'm adding that now, and I'm attaching it to a card base that matches the flower in color. And for the flower, I want to style it. I'm using the Misty pad that was in my Misty before I bought the mouse pad to go in my Misty, and that's what I style on. With a stylus, I go around the back of the flower to add dimension and movement to the flower. You'll see the difference that it makes. on the card. And when I turn it over, I also do some more styling on the front. It gives a lot of movement to the card, and I really like the look of this when it's done. I'm also going to be adding the flower on with foam dots. I just go in a circular motion when I'm doing this, and I'm using the biggest ball that I have from my set. And here where I'm turning up the edges of some of the leaves. And I have a cold, as if you couldn't tell. Adding the foam dots and deciding where I want the flower to be. Seems to be the hardest part. And then I'm going to add the sentiment, which is a frantic stamper die, and I've cut it in glitter cardstock in silver, and I'm attaching that to my card with glossy accents. It's good and strong, so make sure that the sentiment stays attached to the card. And I'm also going to be adding some clear sequins that you can see there to the right. I add them on top of the flowers and around the flowers. Adding them again with the glossy accents. And I'll also be adding Kaiser pearls to the center of the flowers. To finish the card. I'm very happy with the way this one came out, as well as the other card that I did, which I'll put a link to in my post so you can see the both of them. I hope you like this video and that you'll give a thumbs up if you wouldn't mind. And I appreciate you watching and putting up with my silent parts, but it's hard to do this without a little bit of silence. This is where I'm adding the Kaiser pearls. I'm just using the ivory colored pearls. I just want to keep this in the same color tones. So that's the finished card. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.